Did Jesus of Nazareth actually exist? What did people outside the Christian movement say about him? Today, we're setting aside religious texts and looking exclusively at what Roman and Jewish sources, people who had no reason to promote Christianity, recorded about this controversial figure from first-century Judea. The historical Jesus is one of the most debated figures in human history. While billions know him through the New Testament, what can we learn from sources outside Christian scripture? What did his contemporaries and near-contemporaries actually write? Today we'll examine Roman historical accounts, Jewish historical sources, what these sources tell us, and what they don't, why the evidence looks the way it does. A quick note: we are looking at this purely from a historical perspective. This is NT about proving or disproving religious beliefs. It is about what historical methodology can tell us about a first-century Jewish preacher. Before we dive into specific sources, we need to understand the limitations of ancient historical evidence. First-century Palestine was a relatively insignificant corner of the Roman Empire. Jesus wasn't an emperor, general, or prominent political figure. He was an itinerant preacher from a backwater province who was executed as a criminal. From a Roman perspective, this was utterly unremarkable. Thousands were crucified. Literacy rates were extremely low. Perhaps 3 to 10% of the population. Writing materials were expensive and scarce. Most historical records have been lost to time. We've lost most ancient writings. Roman historians focused on emperors, wars, and political intrigue, not provincial preachers. Jesus' movement was initially very small and localized. We have similarly limited contemporary evidence for many ancient figures we consider historically certain. The question isn't why isn't there more evidence for Jesus, but rather is the evidence we have consistent with other figures from this period. Our most important Roman source is Cornelius Tacitus, widely considered ancient Rome's greatest historian. In his Annals, written around 116 CE, Tacitus describes Nero's persecution of Christians after the Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE. Here's what Tacitus wrote: Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate, and a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome. This passage confirms several key historical facts. A figure named Christus, Christ, existed. He was executed during Tiberius's reign, 14 to 37 CE. The execution was ordered by Pontius Pilate, who was prefect of Judea from 26 to 36 CE. His followers formed a movement that reached Rome within 30 years. Romans viewed this movement negatively. Tacitus had no reason to invent a historical Jesus. He was hostile to Christianity, calling it a mischievous superstition. He had access to Roman official records and was meticulous about checking facts. If Jesus hadn't existed, Tacitus could have easily said Christianity was based on a fictional figure, but he didn't. Pliny was a Roman governor who wrote to Emperor Trajan asking how to deal with Christians in his province of Bithynia. Pliny describes Christians as people who were in the habit of meeting on a certain fixed day before it was light, when they sang in alternate verses a hymn to Christ, as to a god. While Pliny doesn't provide biographical details about Jesus, he confirms, within 80 years of Jesus' death, there were established Christian communities far from Judea. These communities worshipped Christ as divine. The movement was significant enough to warrant governmental attention. Suetonius was a Roman historian who wrote the 12 Caesars. In his Life of Claudius, he mentions that the emperor expelled the Jews from Rome, since they had made a commotion because of Christus. Scholars debate whether Christus refers to Christ. Some possibilities. It's a variant spelling of Christus, common in ancient texts. It refers to disputes between Jews and early Christians about Jesus. It refers to an otherwise unknown figure named Christus. If this refers to Christ, it shows that conflicts over Jesus reached Rome by the 40 CE, just 10 to 15 years after the crucifixion. These sources don't describe Jesus' teachings in detail, miracles or supernatural claims, his birth or most of his life. Details about his followers' beliefs. They treat Jesus as a historical figure whose followers started a movement. Nothing more, nothing less. Flavius Josephus, 37 to 100 CE, was a Jewish historian who wrote comprehensive histories of the Jewish people. He's our single most important source for first-century Jewish history. Born just a few years after Jesus' death, Josephus had access to contemporaries of Jesus and official records. In Antiquities of the Jews, 93 to 94 CE, Josephus includes a passage about Jesus that's been heavily debated for centuries. Here's a standard translation. About this time there lived Jesus, a wise man, if indeed one ought to call him a man. For he was one who performed surprising deeds and was a teacher of such people as accept the truth gladly. He won over many Jews and many of the Greeks. He was the Christ. And when, upon the accusation of the principal men among us, Pilate had condemned him to a cross, those who had first come to love him did not cease. He appeared to them, spending a third day restored to life. For the prophets of God had foretold these things and 1,000 other marvels about him. And the tribe of the Christians, so called after him, has still to this day not disappeared. The problem? This reads like it was written by a Christian, but Josephus wasn't Christian. He remained Jewish his entire life. Scholars widely agree that Christian scribes added interpolations, additions, to make Josephus appear to confirm Christian beliefs. Most scholars believe there was an authentic core that was later embellished. A reconstructed, likely original version might read, "About this time there lived Jesus, a wise man. For he was one who performed surprising deeds and was a teacher of such people as accept the truth gladly. He won over many Jews and many of the Greeks. And when, upon the accusation of the principal men among us, Pilate had condemned him to a cross, those who had first come to love him did not cease. And the tribe of the Christians, so called after him, has still to this day not disappeared." Why do scholars think there was an original passage? The style and vocabulary matched Josephus's writing elsewhere. The placement in the text makes sense chronologically. Early Christian writers like Origen, 3rd century, mention that Josephus wrote about Jesus but did NT believe he was the Messiah, which matches a non-interpolated version. An Arabic manuscript discovered in the 1970s contains a less embellished version that reads more like what a Jewish historian would write. Later in Antiquities, Josephus describes the execution of James in 62 CE, the brother of Jesus, the so-called Christ, whose name was James. This passage is almost universally accepted as authentic because it's a casual reference, not a detailed description. The phrase so-called Christ is exactly what a non-Christian Jew would write. It serves Josephus's narrative purpose, describing political turmoil. No Christian scribe would write so-called Christ, and this independently confirms Jesus existed and had a brother named James who led the early Jerusalem church. The Babylonian Talmud, compiled centuries later, 3rd to 6th century CE, contains a few references to Jesus, though they're polemical and historically less valuable. One passage states, "On the eve of Passover they hanged Yeshu, Jesus. And a herald went out before him for 40 days, saying, 'He is going to be stoned, because he practiced sorcery and enticed and led Israel astray.'" This confirms Jewish tradition acknowledged Jesus' existence. The account differs from Christian sources, stoning versus crucifixion, though hanged could refer to crucifixion. It acknowledges he performed remarkable acts, called sorcery here. It shows early Jewish Christian polemic. These Talmudic references are late, hostile, and historically unreliable for biographical details. However, they do show that Jewish sources acknowledged Jesus' existence rather than claiming he was invented. The overwhelming majority of historians, including non-Christian and secular scholars, agree that Jesus of Nazareth was a real historical figure. Here's what the evidence supports and what we can say with high confidence. Jesus existed as a historical person in 1st century Judea. He was a Jewish teacher-preacher who attracted followers. He was crucified under Pontius Pilate during Tiberius's reign, most likely around 30 to 33 CE. His followers believed he rose from the dead. Whether he did is a matter of faith, not historical evidence. His movement spread rapidly, reaching Rome within a few decades. He had a brother named James who became a leader in the early Christian movement. These non-Christian sources don't confirm miracle stories or supernatural claims, provide details about his teachings, tell us about his birth or early life, confirm or deny his resurrection. Historical methodology can't prove supernatural claims. It can only establish that a person existed, certain events occurred, and people believed certain things. Some people argue Jesus never existed, that he was entirely invented. This mythicist position is rejected by virtually all scholars because multiple independent sources from different backgrounds mention Jesus. The timeline is too early for legendary development. Paul was writing within 20 years of Jesus' death. Embarrassing details are preserved. Crucifixion was shameful. Jesus was from insignificant Nazareth. The cultural context doesn't fit invention. A crucified Messiah contradicted Jewish expectations. No ancient critics of Christianity claimed Jesus didn't exist. They argued about who he was, not whether he existed. We actually have better evidence for Jesus than for many ancient figures historians accept without question. For example, Hannibal's existence is attested decades after his death. Most ancient philosophers' writings survive only through later copies. Many Roman emperors have similarly limited contemporary evidence. The standard of evidence for Jesus is often held unfairly higher than for other ancient figures. So what do Roman and Jewish records tell us about the historical Jesus? They confirm the basic historical framework. A Jewish preacher named Jesus lived in early 1st century Judea, gathered followers, was executed by crucifixion under Pontius Pilate, and his followers created a movement that spread throughout the Roman Empire. These sources are limited. They don't read like modern biographies, but they're consistent with each other and with early Christian sources about the basic facts. Historical evidence can establish that someone existed and certain events occurred. But the bigger questions about Jesus' significance, his teachings, whether he performed miracles, whether he rose from the dead, those go beyond what historical methodology alone can answer. They enter the realm of faith, philosophy, and personal conviction. What we can say is this: the historical evidence supports that Jesus of Nazareth was a real person who lived, taught, and died in 1st century Judea, and whose impact on history has been undeniable, whether you view him as a prophet, a philosopher, the Son of God, or simply an influential historical figure. The ancient sources, both friendly and hostile, at least agree on that. Thanks for watching. If you found this exploration of historical evidence interesting, let me know in the comments what other historical mysteries you'd like me to investigate. And remember, history is about asking good questions and following the evidence where it leads, even when the answers are complicated.